My stepdad treated me like a servant for years. Now he's in a nursing home, and I'm his only emergency contact. Growing up, I always wondered why some kids got to have normal childhoods while I was scrubbing floors at 6 years old. My mom remarried when I was 5, and my stepdad made it crystal clear from day one that I wasn't his real son. He had this way of looking at me like I was some kind of burden he had to tolerate because he loved my mother. The chores started small at first, just picking up my toys and making my bed. But by the time I was 8, I was doing laundry for the entire household, washing dishes after every meal, and vacuuming the whole house twice a week. My friends would come over sometimes and ask why I couldn't play because I had to clean the bathroom or organize the garage. I'd make up excuses, too embarrassed to tell them the truth. My mom worked double shifts at the hospital, so she was rarely home to see what was happening. When she was around, my stepdad would act like the perfect family man, ruffling my hair and asking about school. But the moment her car pulled out of the driveway, his whole demeanor would change. He'd start barking orders at me like I was some kind of hired help. The worst part wasn't even the physical work, though my back ached constantly from all the heavy lifting and scrubbing. It was the way he'd criticize everything I did, telling me I was worthless and that I should be grateful he even let me live in his house. He'd inspect my cleaning with a white glove, literally, and if he found even the tiniest speck of dust, I'd have to start over. School became my escape, the only place where I felt like a normal kid. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I genuinely enjoyed learning, but mostly because it was the one thing he couldn't control. When I brought home straight A's, he'd grunt something about how grades don't matter if you can't keep a house clean. When I made honor roll, he'd remind me that I still had chores waiting. The summer I turned 14 was particularly brutal because I was home all day with him while my mom worked. He'd wake me up at 6 in the morning with a list of tasks that would take most kids all day to complete. I'd be scrubbing the kitchen floor while he sat in his recliner watching TV, occasionally shouting instructions or complaints. My hands were constantly raw from cleaning chemicals, and my knees were permanently stained from kneeling on hard surfaces. I started having dreams about running away, just packing a bag and disappearing into the night. But I couldn't leave my mom, even though she seemed oblivious to what was happening. She'd come home exhausted from work, and I'd already have dinner prepared and the house spotless. She'd thank me for being such a good kid, and I'd feel guilty for resenting her for not seeing the truth. High school brought some relief because I could stay after school for various activities, but it also meant more pressure at home. He'd time how long I was gone and expect me to make up for lost cleaning time by working even harder when I got back. I'd do homework by lamplight after everyone else was asleep, fighting to keep my eyes open after hours of manual labor. The breaking point came during my junior year when I got accepted to a prestigious summer program for gifted students. I was so excited, finally seeing a path toward college and a better future. But when I told him about it, he laughed and said I couldn't go because he needed me to help with renovating the basement. I begged and pleaded, explaining how this opportunity could change my life, but he just shrugged and said real men work with their hands, not their heads. That night, I made a decision that would define the rest of my relationship with him. I called my mom at work and told her everything, breaking down in tears as I described years of being treated like an unpaid servant. She was quiet for a long time, then told me she'd talk to him when she got home. I heard them arguing late into the night, and the next morning, she told me I was going to the summer program. The program was incredible, surrounding me with other kids who loved learning and didn't think I was weird for caring about my grades. For 6 weeks, I lived in a dorm, ate meals I didn't have to cook, and went to bed in a room I didn't have to clean. It was like tasting freedom for the first time, and I knew I could never go back to the way things were. When I returned home, something had shifted. My stepdad was still cold and demanding, but my mom was watching now, really watching. She'd make comments about how I deserved to have time for homework and friends, and slowly, the workload began to decrease. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been in years. Senior year flew by in a blur of college applications and scholarship essays. I wrote about overcoming adversity and finding strength in difficult circumstances, though I never mentioned the specifics of my home life. The day I got my acceptance letter to a top university with a full scholarship, I felt like I was finally escaping the prison of my childhood. College was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I'd once reserved for scrubbing floors, but now it was by choice. I made friends who couldn't believe the stories I'd occasionally share about my unusual upbringing. Most of them thought I was exaggerating, which honestly made me feel even more isolated sometimes. I came home for holidays and breaks, but the dynamic had changed completely. My stepdad seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than he'd been when I was a child. He'd still make snide comments about my major or my career goals, but they didn't carry the same weight they once had. I had my own life now, my own identity separate from his opinion of me. After graduation, I moved across the country for a job opportunity. The distance felt necessary, like I needed an entire continent between me and my childhood. I called my mom regularly, but conversations with him were stilted and brief. He'd ask about my job in a way that suggested he thought I was wasting my time, and I'd give short, polite answers. Years passed and I built a successful career, got married, and started a family of my own. My kids never met their step-grandfather in any meaningful way, just brief, awkward encounters during rare visits home. I was determined to give them the childhood I never had, full of play and laughter and unconditional love. When I became a father, I found myself thinking about my own upbringing more than I'd expected. Watching my 5-year-old son play with his toys while I cleaned up around him, I remembered being his age and scrubbing baseboards until my fingers bled. The contrast was stark and sometimes overwhelming, filling me with both gratitude for breaking the cycle and anger at what I'd endured. My mom started calling more frequently as she got older, and I could hear the worry in her voice. She'd mention how my stepdad was slowing down, forgetting things, becoming more dependent on her for daily tasks. Part of me felt a dark satisfaction knowing that the man who treated me like a servant was now the one who needed help, but mostly I just felt sad for my mom. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was getting my kids ready for school. My mom was crying, barely coherent, telling me that my stepdad had fallen and was in the hospital. She'd been hurt in the same accident, something about stairs and a shared tumble, and she was asking me to come home. I booked a flight that afternoon, my mind racing with memories and emotions I thought I'd buried. The hospital was sterile and cold, filled with that distinctive smell of disinfectant and despair. My mom looked so small in her hospital bed, bruised and fragile in a way that made my heart ache. She explained that they'd both been injured when he'd lost his balance on the stairs, and in trying to catch him, she'd fallen too. Her injuries were minor, but his were more serious, and his recovery would be slow. Sitting in that hospital room, listening to the steady beep of machines and the distant chatter of nurses, I felt like I was stuck between two worlds. The adult me, successful and confident, wanted to help my mom however I could. But the child me, the one who'd spent years being diminished and controlled, felt a complex mix of emotions I couldn't easily untangle. The doctors explained that my stepdad would need extended care, possibly in a skilled nursing facility. His insurance would cover most of it, but someone would need to handle the arrangements and serve as his primary contact. My mom was too overwhelmed and dealing with her own recovery, so naturally, everyone looked to me. I spent the next week making phone calls, touring facilities, and filling out paperwork. It was surreal, being in charge of the care for someone who'd spent my entire childhood making me feel powerless. The nursing home I eventually chose was nice enough, with caring staff and clean facilities, but it was still a place where people went when they couldn't take care of themselves anymore. Moving him into the nursing home was one of the strangest experiences of my life. This man who'd once seemed so large and intimidating was now confused and dependent, needing help with basic tasks like getting dressed and remembering to take his medication. He didn't thank me for handling the arrangements, but he didn't complain either, which was probably the closest thing to gratitude I'd ever get from him. I flew back to my family, thinking that would be the end of my involvement. But then the calls started coming, first from the nursing home staff, then from doctors, then from insurance companies. As his emergency contact, I was responsible for making decisions about his care, approving treatments, and handling any crises that arose. The first few times they called, I considered changing my number or telling them to find someone else. But every time I was about to cut ties completely, I'd think about my mom and how much it would hurt her if I abandoned him entirely. So I'd answer the calls, make the decisions, and try to separate my personal feelings from what was practical and necessary. One particularly difficult call came in the middle of the night. He'd had a medical emergency and was being rushed to the hospital. The nursing home needed authorization for emergency treatment, and I was the only one they could reach. Standing in my kitchen in my pajamas, making life-or-death decisions for someone who treated me terribly, I felt the weight of responsibility in a way I'd never experienced before. He survived that emergency and several others over the following months. Each time, I'd have to decide whether to authorize expensive treatments, whether to transfer him to different facilities, whether to pursue aggressive interventions or focus on comfort care. These weren't decisions I'd ever expected to make, especially not for him. The strangest part was how the nursing home staff would thank me for being such a devoted son. They'd comment on how lucky he was to have family who cared so much, and I'd nod politely while feeling like the biggest fraud in the world. They saw the paperwork and the prompt responses to their calls, but they didn't know the history behind it all. I visited him once, about 6 months after he'd moved into the facility. He was sitting in a wheelchair in the common area, staring out a window at nothing in particular. When I approached, he looked up with confusion in his eyes, not immediately recognizing me. For a moment, I saw him as he really was, a frail, elderly man with failing health and fading memories. We didn't talk much during that visit. I asked about his care, and he complained about the food and the other residents. He mentioned missing his house and wanting to go home, but when I explained that wasn't possible, he just nodded sadly. There was no acknowledgement of our past, no apology for how he'd treated me, no recognition of the irony of our current situation. Driving away from the nursing home that day, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely at peace. I'd done what needed to be done, not because he deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. I'd broken the cycle of bitterness and resentment that could have easily consumed me, choosing instead to act with the kind of compassion I'd wished for as a child. The calls continued, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily during health crises. I learned to navigate the healthcare system, to advocate for proper care, and to make difficult decisions quickly. In a weird way, all those years of being forced to be responsible and self-sufficient had prepared me for this role, even though I'd never wanted it. My own children started asking questions about their grandfather, wondering why we never visited him and why I always looked tense after talking to the nursing home. I tried to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, telling them that sometimes adults have complicated relationships and that family can be difficult. They seemed to accept this explanation, though I could see them filing away the information for future processing. One evening, while helping my daughter with her homework, she asked if I thought people could change. The question caught me off guard, and I realized she was probably thinking about her grandfather and trying to understand why we weren't closer. I told her that people could change, but that it usually took a lot of work and that sometimes the damage from the past was too deep to fully heal. As the months turned into years, I settled into a routine of managing his care from a distance. I'd review medical reports, authorize treatments, and handle the bureaucratic aspects of his life while maintaining strict emotional boundaries. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it wasn't revenge either. It was something more complicated and mature than either of those extremes. The nursing home staff continued to praise my dedication, and I began to understand that what they were seeing was real, even if it came from a place they didn't understand. I was being a good son, just not in the traditional sense. I was providing care and advocacy without the emotional investment that usually accompanies family relationships. My mom recovered from her injuries and moved into a smaller apartment, visiting him regularly and calling me with updates. She'd talk about how he was doing, what the doctors had said, and how grateful she was that I was handling everything. Sometimes she'd hint that maybe I should visit more often, but she seemed to understand that our relationship was complicated in ways she couldn't fully grasp. The hardest part wasn't the logistics of managing his care or even the emotional complexity of the situation. It was the realization that I'd become the adult in our relationship, the one making responsible decisions, while he became increasingly dependent and childlike. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and I found myself in the position of caring for someone who'd never really cared for me. Friends and coworkers who knew the situation often asked how I could do it, how I could take care of someone who'd treated me so poorly. I'd explain that it wasn't really about him, that it was about the kind of person I wanted to be and the values I wanted to model for my own children. I didn't want to be defined by his failures or limited by his inability to love me properly. Late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I'd sometimes imagine what it would have been like to have a real father figure, someone who'd encouraged my dreams and celebrated my achievements. The grief for what I'd never had was different from anger at what I'd endured, more subtle but equally powerful. Looking back on everything now, I realized that those years of being treated like a servant actually taught me valuable lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the importance of treating others with dignity. I learned that I could endure difficult circumstances and still maintain my sense of self, that I could be strong without being cruel, and that I could choose my own path regardless of how others saw me. The calls from the nursing home still come, though less frequently now as his health has stabilized somewhat. Each time my phone rings with their number, I take a deep breath and prepare to make whatever decisions need to be made. I'm not doing it for him, really, but for my mom, for my own peace of mind, and for the example I want to set for my children about taking responsibility even when it's difficult. Sometimes I wonder if he understands the irony of our situation, if he realizes that the kid he treated like hired help is now the one ensuring he receives proper care. But then I remember that it doesn't really matter what he thinks or understands. What matters is that I've chosen to respond to his vulnerability with humanity rather than vengeance, and that choice has made me a better person than I might have been otherwise. The boy who scrubbed floors and organized closets grew up to be a man who could handle complex responsibilities with grace and dignity. In a strange way, he helped create the very person who would eventually become his lifeline, though I'm certain that was never his intention. Life has a way of bringing things full circle, and sometimes the servant becomes the master not through conquest, but through the simple act of choosing to be decent when decency isn't required.